What's up, nerds? My name is Cory Bergeron. You are watching Cory Bergeron Recordings, and we are back with another video. And in this video, I'm going to show you how I EQ a snare drum. I get a lot of compliments on my drum sound, and the snare is arguably the most important part of the drum sound. So I'm going to show you what I do to make it sound the way that it sounds. Now, before we jump in, I'm going to bravely say that to get a great snare sound, 80% of it is having a great sounding snare drum and having a great drummer playing that snare drum. That will get you 80% of the way there. Then from there, you can apply the tools I'm going to use to make it sound as good as we possibly can. So what I have in front of me inside this Pro Tools session is two performances. These are performed by two different drummers, two different drum kits, playing two different songs in two different rooms. Everything about them is different. So let's jump into the first one. There is no EQ on the snare drum, okay? So this is the full drum kit. You get the picture. Doesn't sound bad by any means, but I think we can make that snare drum sound better. So let me solo just the snare top microphone. Again, doesn't sound bad, but let's crank the brightness, maybe add some low end, and bring out those ghost notes a little bit. So what I will do is I'm going to open up the SSL Channel Strip. This is not a free plugin, but you can replicate everything I do in this in a stock plugin, and I'll kind of go through it, and I hope it makes sense. So the first thing I would do if I'm going to EQ a snare is I'm going to open up my snare preset. Now, besides adding a high pass filter, this is not manipulating the signal at all. As you can see, it's a 4-band EQ, and the gain is at 0 on all of them, so it's not adding or subtracting anything. But what it is doing is changing the frequency ranges that it's affecting, because I have mixed hundreds of snare drums and I gravitate towards the same frequency ranges. So that's what it's doing. So on the top band, we have 10K. On the mid band, high mid band, we have 1.5K. On the low mid band, we have 500 hertz. And then on the low band, it's a bell and it's 200 hertz. Okay? The reason why I chose those frequencies, 10K is where I get that brightness, make it sound crisp, open, clear. 1.5K is roughly where the crack is. You can actually add or subtract depending on what sound you want. If you're going for like an 80s snare drum, subtracting it will kind of take out that mid-range and make it sound fatter. And if you wanted to just, be a little bit more present in the mix, 1.5K, you can choose to add that. 500 hertz is usually where the boxiness is. So I will, 9.9 times out of 10 take out a little 500 hertz if the snare drum is not EQ'd on the way in. And then around 200 hertz is where the fundamental bottom of that snare drum is. And it's fun to boost that to add some weight to it. So let's go back to our soloed snare drum. And let's start aggressively EQing it to make it sound exactly how we want. So I'm going to listen, change some knobs, and then we'll go from there. So that's a really good starting spot. What I'm hearing is on the snare top mic, there's a really good amount of, or a very minimal amount of bleed from the hi-hat. So it gives me the freedom to really crank the top end and get that snare sizzling without introducing tons of unwanted bleed into the mix. So let's hear that in the track, not soloed. And let's hear it without the EQ. So already, it's already sounding better. It's already sitting better in the mix. I'm really liking the way the snare is sounding. Let's do one more thing to it. This is not an EQ move. This is adding a little bit of compression, but I think this will make it sound better. So this is kind of just like a little bonus. So I'm going to add a little compression to that snare top mic. Cool. Just a little bit goes a long way. It's emphasizing the transient at the start of the hits and kind of bringing up the ghost notes a little bit. So let's hear that in the track. Sounds crisp, sounds fat. Let's hear it without any. And one more time with. makes a big difference. Let me play it one more time soloed without. With. So there you go. That's the first performance EQ'd. I would start there, and then I would start introducing the other elements of the mix in, and then kind of address it as we go. If we need a little bit more brightness, maybe a little less, kind of see how it complements the rest of the mix. But individually, by itself, and in context of the drums, that is definitely where I want it to sit. Not very hard, EQing a snare drum. Let's move on to the second performance. So the second performance is a little bit of a heavier song, so the drums are a little snappier, a little punchier, and I believe the snare is actually tuned a little higher. So this is the drum performance without any snare EQ. Okay, so what I'm hearing is that the kick drum is nice and bright. That would cut through like a metal style mix, but the snare drum is definitely not up to the same standard. So let's get that snare drum poking through. So same thing, I'm going to open up my SSL Channel Strip. I'm going to go to my snare preset, and I'm going to solo this snare top mic. Before doing anything other than this high pass filter, let's listen to it. So right off the bat, I'm hearing that it needs some weight. So let's add some weight. So that's adding weight. Now, since the snare is tuned higher, I found that the low frequency might change a little bit depending on the tuning of the snare. So since it's higher, the frequency might be a little higher. So I'm going to just play around with what we're boosting and see if that makes a difference at all. Even just 220, it makes a little bit of a difference, and I'm liking what I'm hearing. I'm going to just take the output of this down. Let's keep moving through and keep on EQing the snare drum. Taking out some of the boxiness is making a big difference. Keep it going. Okay, so that's making the snare nice and crispy. Let's go through and add just a little bit of compression again. I really like with this compressor that it just kind of like tickles the compressor and adds a little bit. You don't want to overdo it. And that's that. So let's hear this snare one more time. Okay, now let's hear it without. So it definitely sounds less hyped, less full. Now let's hear it without. And let's hear it in context with the full kit. And let's hear it with, in context of the full kit. So there you go. The snare is now sounding like it's in the same space as the kick and the toms. It's equally as bright. It punches. It's got a lot more weight to it, and it's a little bit more consistent across the board. Same thing as I would with the first performance. I would introduce the other elements of the mix and then kind of see where things stand and address as you go. So there you go. That's a very basic and easy way to approach EQing a snare drum. It's not very hard as long as your snare recording is good. Now, I completely understand that you won't always be in an ideal recording situation. Maybe the snare drum you have just isn't cutting it. Maybe the drummer is not quite cutting it. Maybe you've received something to mix and you just have had no control over it, and it's not ideal. But you can use these steps to kind of brighten and make your snare fat, and you might have to get a little creative to make it work depending on the snare recording. But this is what I do when I EQ a snare drum. So I hope you learned something. If there's any other part of a production that you would like to learn about, whether it's drum related, bass, guitar, vocals, anything, let me know and I will gladly make a video talking about it. And as always, if you learned something, make sure to subscribe, drop a like, comment, and that's that. Thank you very much for watching. I will see you in the next video.